Well, thank you for joining us. This is Merrily on High, and we are looking at chapters 9 and 10 this time. So where we left off previously was right when he is going for a nice little trek through the jungle and ends up, I think, looking at a lizard crawling up a tree or something like that, and whoops, then he goes tumbling down a well and breaks both of his legs. And so he says, here on page 121, that afternoon, which seemed like any other, I joined some friends who were going to bathe, but I felt I must go and see one of the seamen who was sick. So after I'd been in the water, I dressed and said to my companions, I'll meet you in the jetty, as I'm going to the hospital. These were the truest words I ever spoke. For taking a shortcut through the jungle, I fell over 30 feet down a disused well, breaking both my legs with such complication it was almost 3 years before I got out of the various hospitals into which I landed myself. So that's where we pick up with him in the hospital. And he begins that chapter by saying, all my life I've had a dream of falling. Not an aspiration, but I would imagine the kind of dream that you have when you were asleep. They say if you dream and you're falling and you wake up before you hit the ground because otherwise you'll die. Well, I can testify that is not the case, because I always hit the ground, and it hurts. Basically, I dream that I have the wind knocked out of me, which is an interesting feeling. I remember the first time that ever happened to me. I had the wind knocked out of me, and I don't know what was going on. I'd never experienced anything like that, and I thought it was going to turn inside out or something.
Just from a dream.
Well, no, this was real.
Oh,
so
okay.
When I was, 10 or something, I fell on the playground and was just,
That's
couldn't
frightening.
breathe, and it was so strange. But yeah, it's basically probably not 100%, but 90% of the times, which doesn't happen that often, that I dream that I'm falling, I usually hit the ground or the water or whatever. Doesn't kill me, but it just hurts. But he fell down a well, and he says, after that, I never had that dream again, that I was falling. And basically broke both of his legs on impact because there wasn't hardly any water down there to cushion the fall or anything. And it must have been a pretty sizable well because it's not like the wells we're more familiar with the pump on the top, where it's just like the size of a big pipe, basically. But it's enough for two of them to get down there together. So a doctor comes down, is lowered down, and he says, in his experience down there, I've never discovered how long I was down there. It seemed like an eternity, and I can remember invoking the help of Our Lady of Walsingham, which of course becomes significant later on. He says there was another long wait after he finally looks up and he sees some faces at the top, and then they say something in whatever language, and then they go get some other people, and then finally someone talks to him in English, and he's like, "No, I'm okay. I need help getting out." So they disappear, and then they says there was another long wait, and I tried to pray, but could find little more to say than "Lord, have mercy," which is a good prayer for all seasons. I found that to be the case. So then they lower a doctor down there who tears up his shirt, making a splint. And I guess because of the restriction on space, he couldn't sit in sort of a makeshift sling and be hauled up that way. He had to stand. And so he says, can you stand for us to pull you up? He says, I'll do anything I possibly can to get out of here. And so he says, thus I was hauled up on my broken foot, and when I got to the top, it was almost at right angles to my leg. Boy. And then it's kind of comical after that. He says, an ambulance was brought as close as possible. Of course, probably not very close. And I was carried on an improvised stretcher over very uneven ground. But they brought no morphine, so I was jogged along with my bones grinding at every jolt. As everyone was dispersing, pathetic shouts were heard in the distance. They had left the doctor down the well. So they go back to get him. And then on page 124, I have been since told that the doctors considered removing my right leg right then and there, regarding it as a write-off, but decided the shock might be too much for me, and they were probably right. So he could have had a Newt Rockney All-American moment where he wakes up and finds his legs were both gone. And then he talks about all the difficulties. The plaster would not set in the tropics where he was, in the damp heat. And so the pins all came out of where they were set. He said, pain is a strange thing and isolates one from one's fellows, and I can understand animals who go away and curl up in the corner to suffer alone. I have only the haziest memory of those days of pain and weakness, but I can remember saying to the chaplain, am I going to die? And his replying, they seem to think there is a chance of it at the moment. Do you want the sacraments? Until that moment, I had not fully realized how ill I was, but I was in such pain and discomfort that the thought of death, holding a welcome promise of relief, was not alarming. I gasped out some sort of confession and was anointed. I was heavily doped, and as I shut my eyes and drifted into unconsciousness, I thought, this is it, and tried to commend my soul to the mercy of God. When I next became fully conscious, I realized that I was still in the ward and knew that I was not going to die. And he said he'd never been a patient in a hospital before. He had certainly ministered to many people in the hospital, but he was very moved personally by the night sister. He refers to all the nurses as sisters, and I'm a little confused by that, if they are religious or if that's just terminology or what. I remember my mother worked at a Catholic hospital, and this was in the 80s, and she was required to wear a headpiece. So I'm thinking it's like the nurses had to sort of look kind of like religious. But I don't know.
I don't know the origin, but in all the British movies, all the nurses are sisters and non-religious. I mean, in spite of there might be a nun that walks by. But most of the nurses are not religious, but that's still a term for I don't know where that comes from.
So do you think they call the nurses sisters?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So they're not,
Too many British movies.
I mean, they're not nuns, but they're
Right.
not,
Yeah.
they haven't taken vows. They're just
Right.
nurses.
Yeah.
I wonder if it goes back, just kind of tradition to the days of
When
the churches were the ones that started hospitals. Well, not just the churches, but the religious orders were the ones that with the hospitals. He talks about how kind of tender and comforting it was. She moistened my mouth and eased my pillows just when I needed it the most and was too weak to ask for help. And that made me think back to reading Ronald Reagan's autobiography. And it was like, 700 or 800 pages. And one of the things that I pulled away from it is he talked about his own experience of being shot and going into the hospital. And he was like, I never wanted to cheat on my wife or anything like that, but I tell you, just that nurse holding my hand at that moment meant more to me than so many things in life, So there's so much tied up in ministering to people in great need like that. And I suppose you can't really appreciate it until you've been on the other side. The hospital chaplain was very attentive, brought me Holy Communion every day, and visited and talked with me a lot. And I was kind of amused by, it's like Stephenson thought he was a big talker, but this other guy out-talked him. And he could hardly get a word in edgewise and was kind of disappointed when the chaplain was transferred or something like that. So he's like, well, when did I get to tell my part of the story? And he talks about the matron of the army part of the hospital was also a keen Anglo-Catholic. This is middle of 125. and often came to see me, although I was not strictly in her territory. And she would tell me of other members of the staff who were high and said, "She's one of us," in such a conspiratorial voice that I felt as if we shared a vice in common, but I've never forgotten her kindness. So there's that kind of, we talk about party spirit a lot of times as a bad thing, but it's also kind of like, a hush-hush club dynamic too, Go across the globe and then you meet, oh, he's one of us. He talks about he had malaria, basically, which was a complicating factor, as you can imagine. At last, the laboratory discovered that a somewhat rare malarial parasite was knocking my white corpuscles for 6, and I was given a series of blood transfusions at once, which worked like a miracle. And then this kind of a drama bomb, the very energetic and animated commander of his naval vessel, when he brings the news to the rest of people on the ship, page 126, they told me that the commander had excelled himself in drama on the evening of my accident. He made a broadcast to the ship's company and began in a voice charged with emotion. "I have the most tragic news to impart to you," so that everyone who heard him thought we must have lost the war and was quite relieved when, after a dramatic pause, he continued, "Our beloved chaplain has met with a terrible accident." And then he talks about how he becomes friends with the chaplain who's ministering to him, and that chaplain is kind of taken with ritualism and wants to make his own chapel, sort of like Stephenson had done on the boat. And they whip together some things, and he gets the nuns to make some vestments and hangings, and they put together a tabernacle and all this kind of stuff. They appropriate some room that was supposed to store chemicals or something like that. They also talked about how they didn't replace Stephenson as chaplain on the ship that he was at, but they had a lot of people kind of come and fill in for a while. And so when he got back to the ship, they reported to him that this other chaplain couldn't have been bothered to put on a surplice and wear vestments, and they kind of took great offense at that. He says, "I was fascinated at the great indignation there was throughout the ship about a chaplain who had refused to wear vestments. Those present had reported he couldn't be bothered to make nice things for the boys. I was surprised that this had stirred up those who had never been near the chapel, and it was considered that he just threw on a surplice, implying, well, anything will do for sailors. When Sunday came, while we're at sea, I could not bear that there should be no mass aboard, so I had myself carried up to the chapel and sat with my legs propped on either side of a card table, which I used as an altar, thus forestalling by many years the now usual arrangement of churches. This was the largest turnout of communicants I had ever seen since I joined the ship, and I reflected sadly that the best way to persuade people to come to Holy Communion was to get oneself almost killed. That made me think about my sister's wedding. The priest there had broken his leg, and he was in a big cast. And he was well enough at that point to hobble around a bit, but he couldn't do much more than that. So he sat on a stool next to the altar for the whole thing, and then everybody else came and went around him, And then he talks about when the ship gets back to port, all the wives and the girlfriends were there to greet everybody. He's single, so he doesn't have anyone, but his mother is there. And then it was kind of a tragic scene because, she's aged. Her hair's gone totally white since he last saw her. And then, of course, he is in horrible shape. So he says on page 128, "Among them, on the dockside, was my mother. I was saddened by how old she seemed to have become since I last had seen her, for her hair had turned completely white. I cannot have been a very cheerful sight myself, for I was considerably wasted by malaria, and had turned a bright yellow from the drug they gave me to keep it at bay. I had begun to lose a lot of hair, and my legs now stank like polecats, so that it was no wonder that my mother burst into tears. Well, I can only imagine, your son goes away and you get word that he's injured, and, thank goodness he's not dead, but oh my gosh, he comes back and both of his legs are busted. Well, he eventually becomes an amputee. He talks about on page 129, the orthopedic specialist of the Navy, who was a surgeon rear admiral. And I'm not sure I guess that means he's just high in rank, but he's a doctor, a surgeon. I don't know if they rank them differently or separately or what. It seems surprising that a rear admiral surgeon would be on a boat somewhere and not like at headquarters, in charge of the whole medical division of the entire, Navy or something. But anyway, he came to see him and talk to him about the leg, and he talked to him at length about what they proposed to do about my left leg, when suddenly he changed his tone and said, "Now, my dear boy, I knew what he was going to say before he told me, that my right leg must come off. Before I joined the Navy, I said to a friend, I don't in the least mind being killed, but I simply couldn't bear to be mutilated. The thing I had forgotten is that God always gives us the grace to bear anything which is laid upon us, and I certainly experienced this vividly at that time, and I hope it has taught me not to worry about the future." And he talks about convalescing, and he has a nice big room and a big window, and there's this interesting aside where he says, on the ledge of the window there was pots with bulbs sprouting and growing tall and flowering and so on. And it was a strange experience as I'd never had before, never since, having time to contemplate living things with undivided concentration. So he was given the opportunity to stop and smell the roses, as it were. And then he talks about the tough ward sister was a battle axe of the highest order, whom I remember with amusement and affection, although at the time her edge sometimes seemed too sharp. Her life was dedicated to taking junior officers down a peg or two. She once said to me, "When I see 2.5 stripes, I know he'll need putting in his place." And then he talks about how he sort of inadvertently became kind of an inspirational witness to others who were in the hospital. His friend brought some vestments and materials so he could say Mass in his room. And basically he was able to do so being sat up on the edge of his bed. And then when he was able to get later on, he would do so from a wheelchair. Not long ago, a priest gave me the news of the schoolmaster in his parish. He told me that we had been in the hospital together. The schoolmaster was a keen churchman, but had formerly been a Methodist. He told this priest that the first thing which made him think of joining the church, I'm talking about the Church of England, was when he had seen me saying Mass in a wheelchair. And so that kind of piety and devotion was very moving to him. And then he's being moved around a lot of places, and he talks about he went to this other place, and it was Sherborne Abbey, and he talks about the vaulting of the ceiling and so on. It sounds like they have sort of cleared this out to use it as a temporary shelter, military hospital, something like that. He doesn't kind of go into the details, but he talks about how there's a school attached there, and he liked to go to the chapel. He says, I went to chapel often, bottom of 132. For the headmaster had a son who served with me at Eastney Barracks. On most Sundays evenings, I was collected, and as the chapel was upstairs, I was carried into it in a chair on the shoulders of the boys like the Pope. And then after chapel, he was entertained in the headmaster's house. And then he says, there were so many nice people there, I kind of lost myself and forgot about my missing leg. And then he was told that what they had cut off was burned, so that when people ask him for his opinion of cremation, he always begins by saying, well, I actually have a foot in both camps. He has one leg that's been cremated and one that will be buried. And then he talked about the mother house of the Anglican Franciscans was not far away, and he was visited by Father Algie, if I'm saying that right, or Algie Robertson. And he paints an interesting picture of this guy. He seemed to live in a perpetual muddle, and wherever he was ought to have been, somewhere else. But he was like a little flame who left fires burning wherever he went, up and down the country. He talks about once time in High Mass, they noticed he left a trickle of water all over the place, and it was discovered that he had a hot water bottle tied around his waist, I guess because it was real cold or something, and it was just dribbling out behind him. He talks about how he was able to exercise his ministry a bit during his convalescence by ministering to the other people who were recovering in the hospitals. He even presented a little confirmation class to the bishop, and there's kind of a comical scene where the bishop thinks the whole ward is about to be confirmed, and he has to hurriedly wheel himself up and stop the bishop from confirming everybody. No, it's just this person here. And then he has this description on page 134 that just makes you cringe. He says, I was fitted for an artificial limb in the bishop's palace at Exeter, which was being used at that time by the Ministry of Pensions. A more unsuitable house for the disabled could not be imagined, as it was full of dark passages and slippery steps. By this time, I was dragging myself around on a full-length caliper, as my left leg had not been set properly. If my crutches slipped, I went down with a sickening thud upon my stump, which made me almost vomit with pain. And then he talks about on the next page this situation at Wingfield, this hospital, where it's not quite clear, but it sounds like there's like one side of the ward that has these big glass doors that open up and a patio or something, so that they can roll the beds out onto the patio and get fresh air and all this kind of stuff. And some of them like to sleep out there. So up near the bottom of 135, one of the Wingfield specialties was to give patients a lot of fresh air, and it was claimed that glass doors had only been fitted to the open side of the wards after one of the nurses was found to be suffering from frostbite. So in other words, they used to not have windows there, I guess. It was just used to be open, or maybe shutters or something. I often had my bed out in the snow, and very nice it was with the stars glittering above, if I kept all but my nose under the blankets. It was not so much fun if it began to rain, and the night nurse was not on the spot. On one occasion, we had to get ourselves under cover, the most mobile of us using as crutches as oars, and the rest holding on to the end of each other's beds like a chain of elephants. And then he talks about now he's back in Oxford convalescing there. He had a lot of visitors. One kind friend took him on a drive to see the crematorium on the day before he had an operation. It reminded me of the day on which I had my leg cut off, when a gift arrived for me by the morning post before I was taken to the operating theater. It was a book called The Divine Crucible of Purgatory. Let's see, he was at Wingfield. They didn't have a ordained chaplain. They were served by students from the theological college that was across from there, which is a low church establishment. So this was the first time in my life that I was ever asked if I were saved. And he says, basically, I'm working on it. And basically, it sounds like there was a lot of kind of hellfire and brimstone preaching, long-winded from the students. And he said everyone in the ward just hated those services, and they complained so bitterly to the chaplain that he asked me if I would be prepared to take services myself. He said it was very testing to have to sit up in bed and preach at the companions with whom one had spent every moment of the previous week. I began to recite the breviary again, for I had plenty of time, and I found it great consolation, as it kept me firmly within the liturgical life of the church. And I have an Anglican breviary, which is very nice because it's pretty much the Roman one, but it's all in prayer book English, and it's all in one volume of like 2,000 pages. That's what I read from a lot of times for the Saint of the Day hagiography. But I need to find out how to use it because it's got so many kind of shortcuts and things to all make it fit in one volume. It's not as user-friendly, so I need to go through those extensive directions and figure out how to use it. Then he talks about on 137, he gets an electric wheelchair. It was then that I got an electric invalid carriage, having started with one which looked like a dentist chair on wheels, but soon getting a new and efficient model. This gave me my first feeling of independence, and I could go off on my own without assistance from anyone. That made me think about, I think it was a 99% Invisible episode, a podcast, talking about how there was sort of a revolution in handicapped accommodations, especially what sticks out in my mind is the slopes at intersections. So you see now they have almost everywhere, there's a gentle, slope with the kind of little bumpy thing, because basically if you had a curb, it was nearly impossible for a person to wheel themselves over the curb, and especially like in an intersection, where you got traffic coming by again and again. I mean, it's hard enough. Have you ever been in a wheelchair and rolled yourself up a hill?
No, but I pushed my
fair share. It is really easy in comparison to push someone up an incline, but it is very difficult to roll yourself up an incline, even a short one. It's like, you're going along flat and then you get to that little hill and you're, because most of us just are not built with that upper body strength to push ourselves around so much. Our legs are strong, no problem. But, boy. And so then he talks about, let's see, we're on page 138. Alex Lawson, one of his friends, had been given, it's interesting this English terminology, he had been given the living, which means he had been called to be the priest of St. Ives in Huntingdonshire. And he went over there with him to help him out during his first Holy Week. And that was the first time that they had put on all the Holy Week ceremonies for the first time. The prayer book has just a collect and lessons for Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I think Saturday, maybe not. But that's it. And so it was kind of catching on to use sort of the fullness of the elaborate Holy Week ceremonies. And so this is the first time they had done it. On Good Friday, the Mass of the Pre-Sanctified was punctuated by the slamming of the church door, as each successive portion of the rite proved too much for the various members of the congregation. On Holy Saturday, having spent almost 3 hours in the consecration of the new baptismal water, the old verger pulled the plug out of the font and emptied it all away. He was done. And he says he went to the shrine at Walsingham several times, and after being sprinkled at the Holy Well, put away his crutches, determined that he would walk without the aid of crutches. Bottom of 139. With God's help and Our Lady's prayers, I have managed to do so, except on rare occasions when my stump has been so sore that I've been unable to wear my artificial leg. And then he's trying to decide what to do with the rest of his life. He's getting back up to the moment in his recovery where he could perhaps go back into parish life. And but part of him is being pulled toward becoming a Benedictine at Nasham Abbey. He's been there before. He's liked it. He's entranced with it. I forgot, his brother is there or something, or his cousin or someone close to him. Yeah. And so he sort of has a foot in both camps, as it were. And the Bishop of Oxford is this situation at St. Mary Magdalene is kind of blown up, where they didn't want the person that was chosen, and they kind of waited them out to get rid of them, and the place has been empty for a year. Well, there's been no official vicar for a year. And so the bishop feels that Stephenson is one person that can really get along with both sides and heal the breach and come help the parish recover. And so he says, he told me the situation at St. Mary Magdalene and how he thought I was the one person who might reconcile the parish and the patrons, as I seemed to be acceptable to both. I told him that I was considering trying my vocation as a monk, and he said, please don't accept St. Mary Magdalene, and then in 6 months tell me you want to leave and go off to Nashdom. So I promised that if I accepted, I would stay for at least 5 years. And I had no idea what an agony it would be to make up my mind. So Nashdom had agreed to take him on as an oblate, and the bishop said he wanted him at St. Mary Magdalene, and so he was left in the middle, and of course he decides to go to St. Mary Magdalene, and he said he had one kind of final operation that really set him on the course to recovery, and because his left leg that he still had was constantly giving him problems. And he says, my left leg had mended after a final drastic operation by his doctor, GRG, when he more or less pulled it apart and stuck one end of the bone up inside the other. So that it's like he used the bone as the splint, as the pin. And I guess it really didn't matter because his other one was cut off, so it's like, yeah, he would be shorter, but you don't have to worry about his legs not matching up. You just get a new,
Think of that, no.
just get a new prosthetic that is the right length. Once when I despaired of it ever joining, I suggested that he take it off, leaving me as a double amputee. He had put his hand on my shoulder and said, I promise you, I'll fix that leg if it's the last thing I do on earth. After I was settled in Oxford, he would often telephone me and say, I saw you belting down Cornmarket today, and I think you're doing too much on our leg. Noting he said, our leg. When he discharged me from the hospital, he said, now go and burn yourself up in Christ's service, but do it very slowly and very wisely. Don't fall down any more holes. So then we get to chapter 10, which is in Oxford, and I have been to this parish. I have not been to a service there, but when I was over in Oxford looking at St. Stephen's house and just wandering around the town looking at the different colleges, I came across this because I remember it was next to the Martyrs Memorial there, which is just sort of an obelisk standing there in the middle of flat pavement surrounded by the roads. And I peeked in, the door was open, so I just kind of peeked in, and it seemed kind of very nice and moody and very high church, and I wanted to go back there on Sunday. So when I was walking back on Sunday, there's this other church before you get there, and it looks very similar. And so I accidentally went in that one.
Oh.
And it was like a low church prayer book situation. And I just didn't feel like right getting up and leaving to see if I could go find this other place, because I was already a little confused and like, wait a minute, is this where I peeked in the other day? I mean, it looks kind of similar, but this is not what I expected. So I didn't end up seeing a service there. But I've been inside, and I remember being sort of perplexed. It's like the spikiest little church in Oxford is right next to the Martyrs Memorial for, the Protestant reformers execution spot. So this is the spot where they were burned at the stake. And so there's that plaque there and an obelisk. He says Balliol College still pays the vicar of St. Mary Magdalene an annual rent based on the number of resident undergraduates, which dates from their foundation in the 14th century when they used a chantry on the north side of the church as their chapel, dedicated to St. Catherine. So I don't know how or why that works the way it does, but they used to have a chapel there hundreds of years ago, and for some reason they still, as a part of the agreement, original agreement, I guess, have to pay a little tribute to the parish, or it says to the vicar. As vicar, I also found myself custodian of the Martyrs' Memorial, which had been erected in what was then the churchyard as a counterblast to the teachings of the Oxford movement. So it only goes back so far. It only goes back probably to the early 1900s. Generations of undergraduates had climbed it, leaving an article of bedroom furniture on the top as a record of their feat. During my incumbency, some young men were caught having pulled a pinnacle or two down in their attempt, and I had to discuss with the proctors what measure could be taken to protect the memorial. I said, could not a referendum be taken in the university to find out the number of undergraduates who would like to see a jerry pot on the top? This is a chamber pot. And if it proves a large number, one could be cemented on. The senior proctor said reprovingly, I sense a point of view coming out, Father Stephenson. And like he describes, the church is sort of very wide and not very deep. So unlike so many churches, which are kind of like ours, like a long hallway, it's more like St. Matthias, where it's like very short and very wide. So it kind of has that intimate feel, like you're always sitting up front, even if you're in the back row. And then he talks about some of his predecessors. Two of them, Canon Clayton, was the one not immediately before him, but before that. He says, Basil Blackwell, the bookseller, once said to me, I suffered terrible things in your church as a boy, for Canon Clayton was the longest and dullest preacher I've ever had to endure. And then Stephenson says, there must have, however, been excitements during his sermons, for I have been told that he was in the habit of descending from the pulpit and giving the cane to a choir boy he observed misbehaving, and then returning to read from his script as if nothing happened. And then the one that followed Clayton was Father Hack. And he talks about 145. His enormous belly must have reminded his parishioners of Canon Clayton, particularly when he preached on fasting at the beginning of Lent, as he heaved it onto the edge of the pulpit. There was a story told of a woman dropping her handkerchief into his lap on a bus. She was too embarrassed to retrieve it, but Hack could see her looking at something. To her horror, he firmly tucked it inside his trousers as he thought it was his shirt sticking out. They must have also been reminded of the canon when someone asked Hack sentimentally what he would put into a children's corner in the church, and he replied sharply, a birch rod. Like Clayton had come down and whipped the boys in the choir. He's remembered in Oxford for complaining about the hill in the Broad Street, which he claimed to find very trying when walking to church. And the joke is there is a hill, but it's almost imperceptibly sloped as you walk toward the church from that direction. He was kind of unique hack in his days. It was a unique situation where, as far as the look of everything, it was very ritualistic, very Baroque, very continental, but everything was strictly by the prayer book. So he says, for years he's been building up a sung mass at 10, in which everything must conform strictly to the prayer book, although the ornaments in the ceremonial were completely Baroque. He would never even insert the Lord be with you, because it was not in the prayer book. Or at least he wouldn't insert it at the places it was not in the prayer book. And he always recited the 10 Commandments. Yet he said Mass in such a completely objective way that often Roman Catholics would attend and not know that they had not been at a Latin Mass. Because a lot of it's so quiet, usually you don't even hear what they're saying. And along with that, he comments, he didn't really like having a congregation and never made any effort that they should hear what was being said. Often before evensong.
What is he talking about?
He's talking about Father Hack.
Oh, okay.
Often before evensong in the winter, he would go around before the service saying, "There won't be many here this evening. Why don't you slip on home?"
Oh my goodness.
And then he would be left to say the office and read Dr. Pusey's sermons to Mary Corbett, which was what he liked best. So he had his little friend there who liked to have Dr. Pusey's sermons read to her. He was kind of a chauvinist. On page 147, once at the Oxford Deanery, we had someone talk on the place of women in the church, which Hack listened to with ill-disguised impatience. The rural dean was unwise enough to ask him what he thought on the subject, to which he replied, "As far as I know, there is only one place for women in the church, and that is on their knees, praying or scrubbing, and there's plenty of use for both." It's a wonder that he had so many devoted women there. And he, to the end of his life, didn't like the idea of doing anything outside of the prayer book. So on the bottom of 147, Hack had said to his friend Alex, "Once I'm dead, don't you go get out your Roman Missal and say, 'He knows better now,' because I don't." When Stephenson got there, the congregation was not very large, but the small group who had fought for the survival of the church had found a unity of purpose, which made them a really solid foundation on which to build. And then he talks about how, unlike Hack, he was willing to kind of proceed forward with the liturgical adjustments that were very common at that point. And in the interregnum, the warden had kind of been pushing them already in that direction. He says on 148, near the bottom, "The congregation had so many changes during the past year that I could more or less do as I wished. And so on the first Sunday, I put the Gloria at the beginning of the Mass. In the prayer book, it's at the end. And the Our Father within the canon, which had become the common practice in more advanced Anglo-Catholic churches. It's interesting that even then, this was regarded as rather extreme, and to some legalists seemed very disloyal to the prayer book, while today it is the norm in all the new rites given sanction by convocation." And in England, they'll never have a new prayer book because it has to be approved by Parliament. And so 1928 was the last shot that they had at that. So now everything is just alternative rites. So that's what common worship is now. They had several go-arounds before. They had an alternative service book in 1980 that was kind of the forerunner of common worship. And it famously had the rubrics printed in blue. So people referred to it as the blue bricks. And then he talks about kind of his confusion. You know, he thought maybe he might get in trouble for this. And then he found out, basically, it's like no one noticed. It's like they don't even pay attention to any of the minutiae of proper Catholic liturgical procedure. Because he says, you know, there's one Sunday when we didn't use incense because we ran out of charcoal and nobody seemed to notice. You know? He says it was wonderful to have such a free hand, for St. Mary Magdalene represented the sort of church which I had always dreamed of. It had a very romantic medieval background, so that I was able to restore many of its ancient customs. And that seemed like fun as I was reading that, you know, to learn about your own parish. And like, oh, we used to do this and we used to do that a couple of 100 years ago. We can do it again. Ringing the bells on the feast of St. Hugh, who had himself consecrated the south aisle in honor of St. Thomas of Canterbury. Beating the bounds after the High Mass on Ascension Day. Keeping the feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and restoring an image of St. Anne, which it was recorded once stood in the Lady Chapel. And then he talks about he starts to get some interest from the locals, various kinds of people, and it seems to be a really broad mix of people, rich and poor, all different kinds of backgrounds. But he gets a lot of educated people from the college, gets a lot of students coming around. And I would love to be in this situation he describes on the bottom of page 149 and on. A number of undergraduates also suddenly began to consider Mary Magds rather smart, and in the curious way in which nothing succeeds like success, there were soon quite a lot of them to fill the odd corners. It was amusing, remembering my own undergraduate days, to have young men trying to spike me up and thinking I was very square-toed because I would not whole hog it as far as they wanted to push me. To me, the great charm of the congregation was that it had none of the stiffness and correctness found in many Anglican churches. I've always found that to be the way here at St. Francis, is that we're far more casual. And I remember Father Allen described it as that St. Matthias was like a sherry-sipping, highbrow place, and then this was like the sort of slum Italian parish across town, where he had a whole mix of people, and everything was kind of informal and thrown together at the last minute and a little disheveled and so on. He talks about kind of the rewards they had of sort of tapping into the changing dynamic of people's lives, where they started a noonday mass where people could kind of slip in for that. And then after his time, they had like a 5 p.m. mass where people would kind of hop in there on their way home. And of course, I was thinking about Oxford. It's like, throw a rock any direction, you're going to hit a church or chapel of something where there's just incomparably beautiful worship being offered in an amazing building with trained choirs. I mean, every single college has I guess you'd call it professional, but I don't know if they're paid, probably paid with scholarships, I guess. Boys choir sing evensong every day, and probably sing in the mornings too. And there's some people who just kind of pop in for that on their way home every day. And then there were some people who would like to pop in for a mass rather than the evensong. So he kind of taps into that market. And he gives a wonderful description, page 151 toward the bottom. I was determined to have a lot of things going on in the church, and I put down times for confession every day, and not only at the end of the week, as in most churches. Someone said to me, I shall never forget the first time I went into St. Mary Magdalene. There were 2 priests hearing confessions, a mass was being said at one of the altars, and there was exposition of the Blessed Sacrament in the Lady Chapel. This was indeed the sort of church I dreamed about when I was a boy. And it's the kind of thing you can make happen where there's a lot of foot traffic around, But we're kind of in the suburbs here, and there's not a lot of foot traffic around here. Just sort of a neighborhood. He talks about some of his assisting clergy, part-time, retired assisting clergy. One, a sweet old man who, never would sing a single note of anything, but he was always there to do a low mass if you need him, or to just sit in the confessional for hours on end. And then he said the most colorful of his honorary assistants was Bishop Roscoe Shedden, who had been Bishop of Nassau in the Bahamas, and then returned home to England, and then on his retirement came to live close by and to help out, and always liked to refer to himself as Stephenson's curate, although he wasn't technically. And then he kind of reminisces about him in his younger days being a very imposing figure and barking out orders and having this voice that would just carry forever and be clear, across the parking lot, across the ocean. It made me think of Father Atwood, who's our canon to the ordinary. And in his former days, he used to be a police officer. And you can really see it when he gets into the church, especially because he's one man who does not need a microphone. He is never, the only time he would need a microphone is if you're going to do a recording like this, But he certainly doesn't need it for amplification. And even when he's just sitting around the table, he's not shouting at you, but he's always, you can hear him exactly. There's no mumbling or what did he say? I would imagine that is a lot what like Bishop Shedden sounded like, except with an English accent. When he was there 5 years, he takes a little breather and goes down and spends, I think, a couple of months in the Oxford mission that goes down to the southern part of Africa along the east coast. The east coast is where all the Anglo-Catholic missionaries went, and so that has a lot of ritualistic outposts. The most recognizable, I suppose, is probably Zanzibar. The Lord Bishop of Zanzibar was always a big figure in the Anglo-Catholic congresses and things like that back in England. He has a wonderful reminiscence on page 156, right in the middle. It's impossible to write fully of a decade as a parish priest because it was so full of joys and sorrows, and they were the joys and sorrows of my people. I can only say that I was conscious at the time that I had the most engaging church and the most affectionate and tolerant parishioners in England. I hope I was a good parish priest, and I worked very hard to look after the people under my care, although I never really felt worthy of the love and affection which was poured out on me. And that echoed a lot with me too. Wonderful places and people everywhere I've been, except maybe All Saints. No. I was just a lowly curate there, so nobody paid attention to me. Let's see. He has a little nice quip on the top of 157. There was a passerby talking about how this is the highest church in Oxford, and then indeed he was delighted one day to hear a tour guide saying, "And on your right, ladies and gentlemen, is the highest church in England," and he was pointing to St. Mary Magdalene. An undergraduate paper observed that, quote, "If you go to St. Mary Magdalene, a sidesman will hand you a prayer book with a knowing smile, which reveals the fact that it will be as of much good to you as an out-of-date railway timetable." He talks about a lady who was, a big part of the parish life, and she passed away, and he was very touched by when he was away on a vacation. "I was touched that her last thought was that I should not be told of her death, as I was away, and she was afraid it would spoil my holiday." That's very touching. In 1951, he says he was elected as guardian of the shrine of Our Lady of Walsingham. So Father Hope Patton, who had started the shrine, or restarted the shrine, had basically come up with a kind of board of directors. And I don't know if that was to sort of qualify for some thing like, maybe like over here, you want to set up a corporation, you need to have some kind of bylaws and board. And so he got some volunteer priests who were willing to be a part of it. At this time, it was probably all clergy. Nowadays, they do have lay members, lay guardians of the shrine, or maybe the lay guardians are only honorary. I'm not sure. But if you ever see some events at Walsingham, they're the ones who wear these long velvet blue cloaks. So they're the guardians of the shrine. And there are active as well as honorary. So, he says it right here. "This is a group of priests and laymen who acted as trustees for the Norfolk Shrine, which had been restored by Father Hope Patton, who, like Noel Coward, was known amongst us as the Master. He was something of an autocrat and used to having his own way. By the time I was elected, there was beginning to be a new generation of guardians who were not as content as their predecessors to rubber stamping decisions which the Master had made without consultation." And so he ends up the chapter by kind of setting up his new adventure in Walsingham by saying that the vice chairman of the board of the Guardians, the vice chairman of the Guardians, that position had come open, and Hope Patton had set it up that that position always has to be a celibate priest. It can't be a married priest. and the vice guardian that they had to resign because he got married. And of course, Stephenson was a celibate priest, and so they convinced him to take the job. But he didn't realize at the time that if something were to happen to the master, then the vice chairman would have to step up and carry on. I suppose he could have arranged for them to find a new chairman, but we'll see how it works out in the next chapter when he ends up at Walsingham because of the death of the founder of the restored shrine, Father Hope Patton. All right.
Well, you want to turn that off?
Yes, we'll turn this off.